Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. It's that time of week again, everybody's favorite segment, the MLB Power Rankings. Guys, it's been a pretty wild week. We saw some shuffling in the bottom row, in the top row. The middle has been hectic all season long, so there's going to be a little bit of teams people disagree with. I love to hear from you guys in the comments, so make sure you drop a comment below what you agree with, what you disagree with, etc., etc. We are closing in on 1,000 subs. We're less than 70 away. I couldn't believe that, and when I started this channel, it was a dream to hit that much. We are so close, so if you aren't subscribed yet, please do so. When we hit 1,000 subs, I will be doing a sub giveaway. There will be an MLB hack going out to one of you subscribers, so make sure you don't miss it. Could be a week, could be 2 weeks before we hit that. It won't be too long because we are killing it. I graded all the MLB teams a couple of days ago. Now we're power ranking them, and we got a new team on the bottom, believe it or not. I put the Colorado Rockies down there. 0-3 against Miami, 1-2 against Pittsburgh. The big difference here for me, they had pretty weak competition in the grand scheme of things. They went 1-5. There was a time in there where they're just giving up so many runs, and it's really hard to get behind the Rockies right now. We had one team that was number 30 for quite some time, and they didn't really go too far. We got the Chicago White Sox. They went 0-3 against Minnesota to start the week after coming out of what was an epic series. They swept Tampa over the weekend before, and then they win this weekend against St. Louis. So if you look at the past 3 series for the Chicago White Sox, they're technically above 500. When I'm looking at the power rankings, I look at these two teams. It could be probably interchangeable. When they play each other, that's kind of what I come down to. I do maybe think the White Sox are going to win that series. I think we have to wait till June to see that epic series, but it is coming, so keep your eyes on the prize for that. Number 28. Not making too much of a movement this week. 1-2 against Philly, 1-2 against Cleveland. Losing week for the Angels. They lose Trout earlier in the week. It's pretty much game over, I would think, for the Angels at this point. This division, while it has been kind of wide open in terms of record and standing, I think they're quite a ways behind some of these other teams, especially now that Oakland seems to be making an impactful season so far. Angels are far and out of it, in my opinion. Next up, we got the Miami Marlins. They started the week absolutely destroying the Colorado Rockies. So at the very least, we can't say they are the worst team in the MLB. So they got that going for them. Maybe with all the injuries and that, it's hurting them. But overall, I think they have a little bit of a brighter future than the rest of these teams. Then over the weekend, they do lose to Oakland, who is probably the bottom row kind of hottest team in the league right now. We'll talk about them in a few minutes here. Number 26. We got the St. Louis Cardinals, 1-2 against Detroit, 1-2 against the White Sox. Just seems to keep getting worse for the Cardinals. I kind of thought they were going to do a little bit better this season. There's probably a lot more high hopes right now. They're sitting last place in that division. Losing to the White Sox kind of starting to be that nail in the coffin for them. They entered the bottom row last week. And as we know from power ranking history, once you're in this bottom row, it can be quite a struggle to get out, and now they're going down. So we could see the Cardinals here for a little bit of time. As we start moving up the board, it gets harder and harder to kind of justify that that team should be in the bottom row. So once you kind of find your way in there, it's hard to get out, and that kind of speaks volumes for this team that is still in the bottom row. We have the Washington Nationals. Sure, they've been pretty solid this year. They're almost 500 on the season. They pretty much put up an offensive showing against the Blue Jays this weekend, winning that series 2-1 at home. And they go 1-2 against Texas. So against two teams that were in the playoffs last year, they have a 500 week. They're having a 500 season. I just see, when I see the teams ahead of them, I'm like, okay, where do I really see them ranking up against these teams? And I just don't know if they're quite there yet. The offense seems to be there most nights for the Nationals, but at times they just get completely shut out like we saw earlier in the week as well. Nationals also seem to have some sort of pitching trouble, in my opinion, giving up as much runs as they did against the Jays. The Jays' offense has been atrocious, so there is a little bit of concern there. Overall, in the grand scheme of the season, still think they're a bottom row team, but they are flirting. If there's ever been a 25 team that maybe doesn't deserve to be there, I think that is them. Number 24, just don't know where to put these guys, honestly. They had such a good start in April. 2 years in a row in April, they've been good. And then this week, they just put up a big dud. 0-3, get swept by Oakland. And then over the weekend, they go 2-1 against Colorado, but it's not like they blew them out of the water. I think they won one game by 1 run. It might have been extras. Don't quote me on that. But Pittsburgh, well, they should be taking that step forward. We've seen the light on them. They just have no consistency. And based on seasons past and where they've been over the years, kind of holding it against them, because when they start to show signs of not being good, I tend to believe it, definitely when it comes to the Pirates. Number 23, they've finally, I think it's been 2 years almost in the making, broken out of the bottom row, and it large part to do with a 6-game winning streak we saw them go over this past week. 3-0 against Pittsburgh, and then over the weekend, I have them going 2-1 against Miami. So they're playing two teams that are lower than them on the rankings, but a 5-1 week, and we saw them have a pretty good week last week as well. They've had a 500 season, and right now, they're not in last in their division. They're in third. Let's keep that in mind. And I still don't know if they're really going to keep this up. The depth is probably not there, but overall right now, they've played solid. I talked about it late in the power rankings season last year. I didn't think they were as bad as they were. I kept them there. I took a lot of hate when I moved them up to 27 at one point, but I do think on paper and in performance, they seem to do all right. Number 22, this might be a team that is threatening to get passed by Oakland. I just wasn't ready to do it. If you look at standings only, sure, you could do it. They went 2-1 against Cleveland, one of the hottest teams in the MLB in April. They win that series. They've had an atrocious start, and if you look back at their last 10, 15 games, it hasn't been nearly as bad as their record shows. I wanted to see them beat Seattle this weekend if they were going to really break out of this bottom. They didn't. That's a tough loss because they got Texas, they got Seattle, who are starting to make some room between the two of them. And if they're going to have any shot at the division, they can't be third in playoffs. I mean, division, you got to win. But if they want any shot at playoffs, they can't be third in this division. I only think 2 teams are going to be able to squeak out of this. But there you have it. Houston still trying to sort things out. Another team that has just been all over the place this season, this week. They started the week off playing a top row team, the Chicago Cubs, winning that series 2-1. Absolutely looking good going into it. And then they play a struggling Tampa Bay team who got swept by the White Sox, and then they get swept. We see times where the heroics come out, like Lindor earlier this week, coming out with the heroics and a walk-off win, coming off the bench. And then we see times where they just don't have it. It's really hard to put my finger on this Mets team. I would love to hear some comments about the Mets, what you guys think of their season so far. Number 20, to have the Tampa Bay Rays. 1-2 against Milwaukee, 3-0 against the Mets. So 4-2 week, playing two relatively strong teams. Mets were a little bit higher last week. The Rays were lower. I even considered at one point dropping the Rays into the bottom row. That's just how I'm kind of at it. This bottom row is really tough. And then when I started really looking into it, I'm like, man, there's no way I can put the Rays in the bottom row. And they just kept pushing their way up. So that series sweep there at the end looked really good. They got to find a way to win in their division, and there's going to be some tough games coming up in their division. It's a tough division, and them being the last in the division is just goes to show what kind of division we are dealing with. Number 19, San Francisco Giants, 1-2 against Boston, 0-2 against Philly so far. They're playing this Sunday nighter, and as you know, I do these power rankings before the Sunday nighter kicks off, so we don't know what's going to happen. Could get swept by Philly tonight. And right now, San Francisco's kind of been that team that not a great week. Again, last week I'm getting called out. San Francisco, there's teams that they should be ahead of. Sure, they passed one of those teams, the Pirates. But like I talk about, from when we're really looking at this rankings from like this row to like 7, it's so interchangeable. All it takes is a 10-game win streak and you're hopping 10 teams almost. So it's so tight in MLB. Teams between 450 win percentage and 550 win percentage is like majority of the league. So it's really tight, and it comes down to what I think the team's going to perform against another team in a long basis. And San Francisco, I have them edged out of most teams. Number 18, 1-2 against Kansas City, 1-2 against Washington. Keeps getting worse for the Jays. They're borderline. They're about to drop down another row. If they don't figure it out, the only thing kind of their saving grace so far this season is their pitching's been relatively good. We saw Alex Manoah come back today and be terrible, as per usual, which seems to be the case. So they got to figure out their 5th starter situation. But their pitching's been good. The bats somewhat came alive against Washington this past week, but the one thing that is saving grace in their rankings for, they did win 5 series in a row, and a lot of those were against tough opponents like the Yankees. So it is holding them in. Overall, their run differential is scary, and they're holding on to 18 by the skin of their teeth right now. Number 17, another team that's kind of like hanging in there. It's been a rough week for the Arizona Diamondbacks. They just aren't winning their division. Their division is very tough. They went 1-2 against San Diego, 1-2 against the Dodgers this week. And for Arizona, they need to win, at least split these series against the teams ahead of them in this division. If they're going to get back to the playoff glory, they got to win. And right now they're struggling. They're having the bad luck on their side. I talked about this last week, but it's just not coming together for them. Maybe it's a little bit regression to the norm for Arizona, and this is more where they should be, a little bit of a Cinderella story last year. But for them, they got to figure it out because they're also hanging on. These are like the hanging on teams, and the teams that are down here, they're pushing. They're pushing for sure. Number 16, trying to make themselves a little bit in a league of their own. But they had a rough week themselves. 1-2 against San Diego. They got swept over the weekend against Baltimore. Had a chance to really show that they're a team to be competitive, playing that top O's team, and they just got destroyed. 0-3. So Cincinnati, every time they seem like they're going to be that competitive team, they take a step back, and this is one of those weeks. How they rebound next week is going to be really important because this is starting to get a little scary for some of these teams. Next up, Detroit Tigers, 2-1 against St. Louis. Did the grading video this past week. I did give the Tigers an A because they were off to such a hot start, and maybe I spoke too soon because then they go into the weekend and the Yankees go 3-0 against them. So maybe Detroit just not quite ready to step into that Central Division crown, but they're floating around. They're pretty much right there average. They seem average on the bats. The pitching is average, like they're getting wins from pitching. The bullpen's somewhat decent. So as a grand scheme of things, for them to be right in the middle, I think they speak pretty well for what an average team does look like. Number 14, San Diego, 2-1 against Cincinnati. Then I got 2-1 against Arizona. So a little bit of a winning week for them. They make the news pretty much with the Reyes trade. They're bringing him in to lead off for this team, and it's going to be a big, impactful bad guy that can get on base. Slam Diego, being able to hit him home. I like what the Padres did this week. Big wins against teams that are pretty close to them, like Cincinnati, Arizona, some wins there. They're hopping up. They're getting their name in there. And I think of all the teams, this is one that I might have my eyes set to make a threat at the top 10 relatively soon. Next up, 13, Kansas City, 2-1 against Toronto, 1-2 against Texas. So pretty good week. Kansas City, I was really wanting to see them build off of what they had been doing. Their pitching continues to be good. They had their chance to really win this series against Texas, which would have been massive today, but they end up blowing it in the 9th and then again in the 10th. So they don't manage to sneak that out. I think overall, are they going to be able to keep this going for the whole season? Bobby Witt Jr. making a play at MVP possibilities. We got to see it. This is a young team that hasn't really been in some meaningful baseball once we start getting to June. So can they hold on? That's going to be very important for this team. Next up, moving up, Seattle, 2-1 against Atlanta, 2-1 against Houston. Just a massive week, and it's been kind of a massive couple of weeks for Seattle. They've really slowly chipped their way, and they are leading the the American League West right now, which I don't know if you had it on your bingo card that they'd be winning it based on their winning percentage. I don't think anyone would have had it, but they're doing it right, and they're starting to figure out their rotation and starting to get it done, and the bats are starting to figure it out. And it was a really slow start for Seattle, and there was a lot of concern. We had them in the low 20s early in the season, but they've chipped their way back up. A lot of people are probably going to say maybe they should be higher. They're number 1 in the AL West. They are probably one of the hottest teams in the MLB. The thing for me is I want to see them start playing against these top 10 teams. I don't think we've seen a whole lot of it. Maybe it's just me missing it, but that's what I want to see. I want to see the rotation be consistent for a little bit longer. Number 11, to have the Boston Red Sox, 2-1 against San Fran, 1-2 against Minnesota. So 500 week, average week. They were showing that they were pushing. Last week I had them in the 10 spot, and they've been pretty underrated for me most of the season. I did give them an A in that grading video. Was really excited with how they're doing, but it's all about what you're going to do for me lately. And 500 is not going to do anything to keep you up. And as you start moving up the board, if you keep putting up 500 after 500, you're going to find yourself moving down. So whether Boston can keep it going, we've yet to see them really play too much in their division, just the one series against Baltimore so far. So that's going to play a big factor in where they end up on this board. Number 10, 12-game winning streak this team did have. 3-0 against the White Sox this week, 2-1 against Boston. Mind you, a 12-game winning streak, while still impressive, 2 of the series were against the White Sox. 1 of the series was against the Angels. So there you go. That's like 9 right there. But not to discredit them, they got off to a terrible start. I had them super low, and they just immediately, over the past 2 weeks, just skyrocketed. And that's what 12 wins in a row is going to do for you. Division is back on the table for these guys after a lot of concern. We ran an AL Central poll on the channel. I didn't see what it was. The results are just now, but we had about 50 votes a day or two ago, and it was really close. So if you guys didn't vote in that, let me know who you guys think is going to win the AL Central. Number 9, I do got the Cleveland Guardians. 500 week for them. 1-2 against Houston. 2-1 against the Angels. So after such a hot start, they go 500. They're playing the West Coast, right? Houston, they've got to play. They got to beat these teams while they're down. They lose the series there, and Houston's always that ALCS championship team. But if you're going to continue to build, you got to beat these teams. So 500 week, I'm not going to hold it too much against the Guardians. And part of what I find to be successful in my rankings is if a team doesn't really move. And that's been the Guardians for the past 3 weeks. They've been right here in this area. So it seems like I have them kind of pegged right. We'll see if they can keep it going. They still got to have a winning percentage to keep in this top 10. We'll see how that goes. Next up, Milwaukee, 2-1 against Tampa, 1-2 against the Cubs. Interesting week. For them to go 500, the series against the Cubs, always very impactful when it comes to power rankings. Division games do mean a lot because you tend to kind of start to clump up with some of your teams sometimes, and it's always cool when you start playing each other. And for them to lose the Cubs, it's going to be a little rough. They did manage to steal 1 on the Friday, and the Cubs came back and won the next 2. But Milwaukee, they're one of those teams that I'm still not quite sure. We see glorious times with them. Their offense just absolutely popping off, and their pitching has been pretty incredible. A lot of surprise to me. But then there's times that are just not there, and I'm trying to figure out where the consistency is with this Brewers. Overall, I think they have the roster that is going to be very competitive, especially in this division, so it's pretty interesting. Number 7, moving up a couple of spots, 2-1 against Washington, 2-1 against KC, a 4-2 week against lower teams, but Texas continues to kind of roll along here, chugging along. I do think this is going to work out very well. Texas, they did this last year. They kind of chugged along all season long, made it into the playoffs, won the World Series. They know what it takes. They're going to set themselves up for a marathon style game. And at the end of the day, Texas can compete with anybody on this list. Whether they beat them in 7-game series, whatnot, I'm not sure about it right now. But overall, dealing with what they've been dealing with all season, I do like what Texas has managed to do. Number 6, I think I got them in the same spot. Mind you, this is where it starts to get a little interesting. 6 through maybe like 10. Pretty tight, maybe even 12, very tight. But I think once you get to 5 and up, it's a whole different game. So 6 is probably one of those spots that these teams are going to be fighting for relatively soon. It's the last spot in the top row. And 500 for them this week, 1-2 against the Mets. But the series win against Milwaukee, who I had 7th last week, was important for them to just hold on to this at least number spot 6 for one more week. Whether they hold on to it in another week, they got to keep winning baseball because there are a lot of hungry teams following them up. Number 5, dropping a couple of spots, 1-3 against Baltimore. So that's the difference in terms of going from, I think they were 3rd to 5th, or might have been 2nd. That's the difference, losing pretty decisively in that series against a team that they're very competitive with. Sure, if you look at the standings, they're tight. They're the tightest between those two. But the pitching does concern me. Aaron Judge's struggles somewhat concern me of this team. They do have him locked up for a long time. If they're don't manage to re-sign Juan Soto, what is the future of this team going to look like? The bullpen, on the other hand, seems to just be figuring it out. It seems like the next man up always at the New York Yankees. So that at least is super positive going for them. They bounced back huge after that series with Baltimore. So they're right on the edge of going back up. All it takes is one of these teams ahead of them to stumble even more and them to have a good week, and they're going to move right back up, a sweeping Detroit. Number 4, I got the Philadelphia Phillies, 2-1 against the Angels, 2-0 against San Fran so far. They have taken the lead in the NL East division. Arguably, you could move them up even farther. They've been so hot, such a good offensive team, but kind of looking over their last 10, 8-2 over their last 10 like that. I do want to kind of realize that Atlanta, to me, has had a little bit of a tougher schedule, so I expect it to even out a little bit. Philadelphia, if you look at their overall schedule, has only played 6 games against teams above 500 so far, so that does play a little bit into it. But at the end of the day, I do think they're competitive, and they're an amazing team so far. Yeah, that's where I got them. Number 3, it's the team they're chasing, right? And they're probably the one team that stumbled the most in the top 5, but they've had the benefit of being number 1 for a couple of weeks. They have the benefit of being such a dominant team over the past couple of years. I am giving them a little bit of leeway, 1-2 against Seattle, and this past weekend getting swept by the Dodgers. It feels like the game that went to extras on Friday just set the tone for the rest of the series, and the Dodgers just finished it from there. So not holding too much into that one series. Of course, it means a big difference between 1 and 3. But at the end of the day, these two teams they're destined to battle all season long, and I'm super excited to see it. Number 2, I think the highest ever they've been on the power rankings. We have the Baltimore Orioles, and I think at this point, without a doubt, they are the strongest team in the American League. They kind of set their tone against the New York Yankees earlier this week. The young guys, the power, the only concern that we've seen a lot of is the bullpen. Can they close out games? We saw them almost blow the game against Cincinnati again this past weekend, but they find the sweep against Cincinnati for a 6-1 week. The Baltimore Orioles are flying high. I know O's fans on the Discord are super pumped about that. Number 1, I don't think there's much argument for this. 2-1 against Arizona, 3-0 against the 3rd place Braves. The Dodgers are on top. I did a grading video, gave them a C, received a lot of flack for that. And mind you, it's because if you're not number 1 on the power rankings as the Dodgers, you don't get anything but an A. And if I had to do it again after 4 games since I did that video, their grade letter would change dramatically. It's just been that big of a difference between 5 games. Absolutely crazy, wild week in the MLB. I think if you look back at last week, the power rankings are quite shuffled. Pretty interesting. A lot of teams jockeying for position. A lot of teams are finding momentum, and other teams are struggling that you don't really see happening. And a lot of the middling row here starting to struggle, where we have hungry teams down here in the bottom, and we got a big top 5, I think, that's pretty solid, but who's gonna make a contender for it? Because number 6 is definitely up for grabs. Let me know what you guys think. Comment, subscribe, like the channel. We will see you for that next video.